used to be a forest is a forest, but now we're realizing more things about forests and the many different niches that they fill and all of the, just more different roads, I guess, that we can take with Chestnut restoration than we originally had thought about. So, and I really was, I warmed right up to Hill Craddock the first time I met him at a meeting because he's the first person who set up chestnut food. He had all little dishes of different types of chestnuts that we could taste. And I thought, oh, another foodie, that's good. I was so happy to say that. So that's why I played that today. So now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker. And this kind of happened because of Rufin Van Bossett, and he's always our go-to guy for anything because he's a forester and he just knows a lot of stuff about everything. You know, he fixes our problems and all that kind of stuff. And when we were kicking around ideas about a guest speaker, he said, oh, take this book home and read this book. And it was this book right here, the Stephen Long Hurricane of '38 book. And I did, and it was great. So we didn't even look any further. We immediately called Stephen, and he agreed to be our speaker. So I just want to let you know a little bit about him. He's a former fellow at the Harvard Forest, and he is actually one of the founders and former editor of Northern Woodlands Magazine, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. He will fill us with accounts of the hurricane of 1938 and its effects on the forests of New England. I'm back there, Brad. And he'll relate stories of local history and talk about meteorology, botany, ecology, politics, and economy. And for those of you who are looking at forests we're looking at forests in a different way. Thank you, Yvonne. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Stephen Long.
Thank you very much. That was an inspiring talk. I was glad to see that. Thank you. So the day after the hurricane, it happened September 21st, 1938, the Boston Globe had a story that included this line, that a tropical hurricane hit Massachusetts and the rest of New England for the first time in the history of the area. They didn't do much research that day. There had been plenty of hurricanes that had hit the area, but there was only, previous to that, there was only 2 Category 2 hurricanes that hit the area. And so those 2 were 1635 and 1815. Each of them a Category 2, and then so that's in the history of settlement, of European settlement in 500 years. That's only 3 Category 2 hurricanes that have hit inland. Now we've had some, like Bob, I think Bob was either a Category 2 or 3 that hit, its effect was almost entirely on the Cape. So I'm talking about ones that have hit and affected central New England. So the track of the '38 hurricane came across from Africa. They often start off the coast of Africa, head west, and it was aiming for Florida, and people were very, very concerned. And once that they saw that it had turned and that it wasn't going to hit Florida, people sort of breathed a sigh of relief because they figured that it was going to take this track here. And weather forecasting at that time compared to now is quite primitive. You think of, we now have satellite radar. We know when a hurricane is coming. There's just no way that it's going to surprise us again. But back then, one of the key elements to weather forecasting was getting radio transmissions from ships at sea. And so they had been so effective at touting this hurricane, aiming for Florida as a really, really potentially devastating hurricane, that ships either stayed in port or they got the hell out of there. And so basically they had no reports to work with. And so when it turned north, they assumed that it was going to do this sort of standard recurve. Out here, you see Bermuda here, there's basically a stationary high system out over the ocean here called the Bermuda High. And hurricanes are low pressure systems and they do not mix with a high pressure system. And so this is a very, very standard track of a hurricane to make that recurve to the northeast. Just to show you how common it is, this is the year 2011. This is the year that Irene hit here, and see all of the hurricanes that came this way and then recurved. And they do so because the weather on the continent generally comes from west to east, and so we've got all of these this weather coming in this direction, and it just mixes with the hurricane and pushes it to the out over the ocean. So in 1938, that didn't happen. Just to go back and so you see, instead of recurving, it went almost due north. And the reason it went almost due north was because, unbeknownst to the forecasters at the time, the Bermuda High was stationed much more northerly than it ever is, and so it was basically up in here, and so there was no place for the hurricane to turn to, and so it just proceeded north and hit New England with the most damaging weather event that it's ever experienced. So. It hit Long Island first, and then Connecticut and Rhode Island with a storm surge. Tremendous tidal wave, essentially, where entire beachfront communities were swept out to sea. 600 people were killed in the 38 hurricane, 400 in Rhode Island alone. Most of the deaths were down on the coast. This hurricane came totally unannounced. Nobody knew it was coming. Nobody knew it was coming down there, and then nobody there was able to warn anybody further inland. Nobody really thought that it would keep coming inland, and so everywhere that the hurricane of 38 hit, it hit without any warning whatsoever. So there was a storm surge, then there was inland flooding. So this is where Massachusetts, take a look, keep your eye on that building on the right there, and you see the power of the flood. Oh. So it just ripped the underpinnings right out from that building. There was flooding basically throughout New England, and interestingly enough, a lot of the flooding happened prior to the storm. 1938 was a very, very rainy summer. And in the week prior to the storm, totally unrelated system, there was a flood. So New England was in flood stage when this entirely different system came up. And so it brought all sorts of rain with it as well. But in many places in New England, it had between 6 and 10 inches of rain before the hurricane of 38. So if the hurricane of 38, if the winds hadn't arrived, it would have been the flood of 38. So, but the winds did arrive with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, sustained winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The highest wind was recorded at the Blue Hill Observatory, 186 miles per hour. It broke the instrument there, so it could have even been more. So I got some images of what happens when you get 100-mile-an-hour winds, and you see that we have trees down everywhere. These are, a lot of these are elms, interestingly enough, and so we've got two interesting natural disturbances happening at once there, with the elm still existing on a lot of streets before Dutch elm disease. More street scenes here of there's power lines down, there's telephone. That basically there's no communication. You couldn't get anywhere, and this was a 90-mile wide swath through New England. So basically from the New York border all the way into Maine, we've got this just serious wind. More houses with trees on them. People just were not able to get anywhere. Churches were affected. Here's a steeple, a church in Monson, Mass. And then this next image is one of my favorites of a steeple. I'm going to linger on that for a little bit so you can really see what it is. So you've got two guys down here sitting in the pews. The steeple has broken through the roof, and they're just sitting there nonchalantly chatting about what happened. But so that's in East Bridgewater. So just a tremendous destruction to infrastructure. The Big E, the largest fair in New England, was happening at that time, that week. So it had been flooded. A lot of people had already left. People had been evacuated. But so you've got the floods, and then you get 100-mile-an-hour winds. So you see the Ferris wheels in the back, the various displays, everything on the ground. So a lot of what's been written about what happened in the 38 hurricane has been about what happened down on the coast, because it's so dramatic. There's so many people who died. It's just a tremendous natural disaster. And there's even a movie star involved. So Katharine Hepburn here on the left lived in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, and she's sitting in what's left of her house. Because so much has been written about what happened on the coast and not that much of what happened inland to the forests, I wanted to tell that story. And so I talked to people like this fellow here, Fred Hunt, forester who grew up in Rindge, New Hampshire, and developed a big career in white pine management. He wrote the first management plan for Quabbin Reservoir. So Fred was 14 years old at the time of the storm, and he was playing hooky that day because the area was flooded, and he wanted to go and see what a village underwater looked like. So he was out, and I tell the story of what happened to Fred when the hurricane came in. It's a pretty dramatic story, but I'm not going to tell you that now. You'll have to read the book. Basically, though, just a teaser, essentially the entire forest blew down around him while he was crouched underneath a white pine that had blown down. So the first white pine near him blew down, he got under it, and the rest of the forest blew down, and it took about 10 minutes for the rest of the forest to blow down. And so it looked like this. So you got 600,000 acres across New England that are flattened. A lot of it was white pine, particularly in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. A lot of it was white pine. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. 600,000 acres, 2.6 billion board feet on the ground. So I'm sure there's some foresters and there's some people who know the way around the woods, but just to give you a concept of what 2.6 billion board feet is, Here's a log truck with 6,000 board feet on it. You see these trucks, you know, every day out on the highways. So here's a truck with 6,000 board feet. So on the ground in a 5-hour period, one day, 430,000 truckloads of logs like this. So a convoy would stretch from Boston to Seattle and back again. A tremendous, tremendous amount of wood on the ground. We know that because foresters spread out across the region in the next week, and they measured the blowdown. And so here's one, and here's he's standing in front of a root wad of a tree that blew down. So, you know, this is a tree planting group, and so you know that when you bring like the pot that he brought, you got this pot, or you got a root ball of a bigger tree. So when you plant something like that, you might think of a root system as a root ball. And as that tree develops, though, it stretches out. It doesn't necessarily go deep. It stretches out. And so it's more like a plate. So here's a very good picture of what that is. So a root system is really a root plate. And so he's there demonstrating the size of a huge tree that went. Here's two more foresters out doing their inventory. And so you notice that foresters in those days wore fedoras. And I think that some of the foresters in the audience today might take that as a bit of advice, you know, that you sharpen up a little bit. And skip the ball caps and go back to fedoras. Here's another one. So we've got all of these trees on the ground. You've got a 90-mile wide swath, but you see that the destruction, it wasn't one big 90-mile wide blowdown. The destruction was very, very disparate from one spot to another. There would be a half acre here, 5 acres there, and the largest opening made by the hurricane was about 90 acres. So there's a number of reasons. That was one of the things I was very fascinated with, trying to find out, well, why was it like that? Why would one area be hit really hard and another not so much? So there's basically these 4 reasons that I'll go through fairly quickly here. But the first reason would be what side of the storm track were you on? So if you were on the west side of the track, you probably wouldn't have gotten much damage because the hurricane is a cyclonic system. It goes counterclockwise. And so if you were on the east side of the storm over here, you're getting the combined effect of the forward motion of the storm going 50 miles an hour from the south. So you got winds that would have been, if it was a straight line storm, you would have gotten a 50-mile-an-hour wind. But because it's cyclonic and it's going at, say, 50 miles an hour around, on the right-hand side, on the east side of the storm, you've got a combined 50-mile forward motion, 50-mile-an-hour cyclonic, and you get 100-mile-an-hour winds. So east of the storm, you got 100-mile-an-hour winds. West of it, nothing. So I did a talk over in Middlebury, Vermont, and right over in here, talked to some farmers who had lived through it, and basically it was a flood event for them. They didn't, the wind on the back side of it sort of cancels it out. So they had tremendous flooding over there, but not so much wind. So the wind, the most damaging wind, was from the southeast. So you know, so the wind basically all the way, you know, you're getting it from southeast to northwest. So given that, then the topography enters in. So if your hill faces south or faces east, then you're really in the crosshairs. So this land here on the top is my land in Corinth, And so this is facing south, this is facing east, so this whole bowl got knocked down in the 38 hurricane. And this aerial here is the backside of that same hill, so that's facing north, and there's no damage on that side of it. So aspect and slope, the steeper the slope, the more potential for damage, and if it faces east or south. If it faced north or west, either little or no damage. Another factor is what was growing on the land. In Vermont, in 1938, people were still farming, so you didn't have a lot of forests. You had 45 to 50% forest cover. But in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, farming had gone out as an economic driver starting, say, in the 1860s, 70s, 1880s. So by the time the 1938 hurricane came, you had a pine forest that was larger, that you had more pine growing in Massachusetts and New Hampshire than you ever had before, and that was standing tall and just ready to blow down. And white pine is a particularly vulnerable tree. It grows tall, it's shallow rooted, and the taller the tree, the better the lever. So a tall tree standing up above its cohorts is just standing up there ready for the wind to knock it down. So these pines on the lower left, those would have been, that's a photo I took, I don't know, 5 years ago, but those trees would have definitely been on the ground in the 38 hurricane. Up here, this is a 38 photo, and so you see these are hardwoods. The larger hardwoods are down, but the smaller ones are not, and the smaller ones are more supple. So if you got a 10-inch or 12-inch diameter tree, it's a really good lever. You got a good sized crown. It'll sway in the breeze, but ultimately that trunk is gonna act as a lever, and the roots are gonna come out of the ground. The smaller ones just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and they live through it. So it depends on the size and the species of trees. Now, the chestnut angle on all of this is that the destruction in Connecticut was considerably less than it was in the other states, because chestnut had been such a huge part of the forest in Connecticut. So as they started salvaging prematurely or not, salvaging the chestnut forest in Connecticut in the first decades of the 20th century, they reduced the number of trees that were big and tall, and so you had basically a pretty newish forest in Connecticut. And so both Connecticut and Vermont had different experiences of the hurricane than New Hampshire and Massachusetts. So with all of that timber on the ground, people were very, very concerned about the possibility of a second catastrophe on top of the first. And so you see these trees here, they've been stripped of all of their brush. This is 1938, this is the New Deal. This is the time when we have the WPA and the CCC as ready workforces available. And so these, the WPA Works Progress Administration, CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, these men from these two organizations were brought into the cleanup effort, and so they're trying to clean up as much of the brush as they could in vulnerable places. And so you see here we've got a fella with a saw and another fellow with an axe. This is 1938. There was no such thing as a chainsaw at that point. So all of this work is done by hand. with hand tools. So roadside, they would pile brush roadside. This is a WPA crew in Keene, New Hampshire. And so you just look at all of the brush there on both sides of the road piles. So what they did is on a rainy day or in the winter, most of this cleanup was done in the 6 months following the storm. So in the winter when they had snow cover, they would just torch these piles. And so there's thousands and thousands of piles being torched either with snow cover or on rainy days. So it's funny, I've spoken to people about this for the last 2 years, trying to get somebody to tell me, yes, it was just full of smoke. I mean, it was just smoky, nothing but smoke. But nobody remembers that, nobody says that. But I mean, really, there was hundreds of thousands of brush piles that were done. The CCC crews were in competition to see who could burn the most in a day. So it was I'm kind of, I'd love to get some sort of an eyewitness account of that. And I've spoken to plenty of people. And by now, since it's 80 years ago, people have to be now 85 at least before, or else they couldn't tell me a story. So I'm going to read just a little short section here that has to do with the fire danger. And this on the slide here sort of gives you a sense of what these crews accomplished. Just a little reading from the book. Forestry officials differed on how great and how imminent a fire threat they faced. Austin Hawes was one of the many early graduates of the Yale Forestry School who filled important forestry positions at very tender ages, taking the position as state forester in Connecticut the year after his 1903 graduation. He served 2 tours in Connecticut, sandwiched around a dozen years in the same position in Vermont. In 1938, he'd been the man in charge for nearly 35 years, a seasoned leader full of experience with forestry and with fire. Looking back at the hurricane response in his 1957 book, The History of Connecticut Forests, he reported on a meeting held in Boston 2 weeks after the hurricane. Also in attendance was Ward Shepard, who had been appointed director of Harvard Forest following the sudden death of founder Richard Fisher in 1934. Hawes didn't bother with diplomacy in his assessment of Shepard's qualifications for the role. There could hardly have been a worse appointment. Mr. Shepard knew nothing about forestry in New England and had little training in silviculture. The hurricane destroyed the magnificent pine forest of the Harvard Forest, and Director Shepard was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Not realizing the difficulty of burning green timber, he conceived the idea that all of New England was in immediate danger of conflagration and rushed to Boston to get the governor of Massachusetts to take immediate action. Shepard was a Harvard Forest alum whose primary on-the-ground forestry work was in the high desert forests of New Mexico and Arizona. More recently, he had worked in Washington, D.C. as a policy analyst and a public relations officer for the Forest Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. These positions meant that Shepard had the ear of national officials and he wanted their immediate assistance. Hawes reports, the dramatic point in this conference was reached when John Foster, State Forester of New Hampshire, stated in his calm way that he did not consider that there was any danger of immediate conflagration so long as the timber was green. Mr. Ward Shepard became so red in the face and so outraged, I thought he would burst a blood vessel. He was indignant that a forester should make such a statement. Some foresters, proudly calling themselves dirt foresters, have mud on their boots and tree marking paint on their vests and trousers. Others are marked only by ink and paper cuts. Shepard was the latter. Hawes's description of Shepard's agitated state is fleshed out by a story in Harvard's student newspaper, The Crimson, in which the Harvard forest director fed the writer some brimstone. This is a quote, "The fires that are likely to result from the accumulation of these huge piles of timber will be of a spectacular variety which has never been seen in this part of the country, usually being confined to the great timber stands of the West Coast," he said. "They will be of the type known as crown fires, where the flames shoot to a height of 500 feet, creating a mighty draft which throws burning brands half a mile ahead of the main blaze and makes it absolutely uncontrollable." The article concluded with a dire forecast for public safety. Whether this area can be saved, even with the strictest precautions observed, seems doubtful to Shepard. And while planning for the safety of Petersam's 700 inhabitants, he more or less expects the town to be leveled to the ground, along with an inestimable part of the surrounding country. Shepard delivered that apocalyptic vision to the Boston meeting and to the opinion pages of the region's newspapers, foretelling firestorms racing through villages and swallowing everything and everybody in their path. So there was a great difference of opinion about how much danger there was. And clearly you've got a lot of wood on the ground, and for that first year, while you just got all of these really fine materials, you probably could have had some fires, and they did a lot of good work to reduce the fire threat. But we've just seen this whole thing in California. I mean, that's what he's describing, and that was just devastating out there. But that sort of thing is just not likely to happen here in the East. It's a different forest and a different climate, and it takes the absolute right conditions for that to happen. So a really, really dry spring, all of these fine materials, and so I think that the threat of fire was pretty well overblown. So we've got all of the brush being cleaned up, but then what about the logs? So we've got 30,000 landowners whose woodland bank accounts have been knocked on the ground, and so the federal government, the New Deal, so they set up the New England Forest Emergency Program. That's the one that dealt with the brush. The Northeast Timber Salvage Administration dealt with the logs. And so they set up a program where they would buy, anybody who could deliver logs to either a log yard or to a pond, they stored a lot of the wood in ponds because they didn't think that they would be getting to it to saw it very quickly, and so they wanted to preserve it by putting it in water. They would buy it. So the federal government set up a market for this. Now, if you think that you've got 2.6 billion board feet on the ground, that's 5 times the annual harvest of this region. 5 times the annual harvest. Who is going to pay a nickel for that wood? What private sawmill would have to pay? So basically, without creating this artificial market, none of these landowners would have recouped anything. And so in Massachusetts, there were 283 storage sites. This image shows this was sort of it's a map that lives at the Harvard Forest, and it's got all of these pins and markers are various sites of storage sites, it's probably this fold-out map is about maybe as big as this back here. It's this, and it folds up. It's a very, very cool artifact of it. But so it shows you where each and every of the storage sites was. So this focuses on the area around Petersham, and you just see how many sites there were. But so basically, in Massachusetts, they salvaged 300 million board feet. Rhode Island was considerably less than that, but there were 73 storage sites in Rhode Island, and about 4% of the quantity. Rhode Island was 80% white pine, as opposed to back in Massachusetts. You see, it was 98% of what was salvaged in Massachusetts was white pine. Just incredible. So here are some photos of the sawmills of the day. This is a portable mill, and it's portable not in the sense that a wood miser is today, where you pull it in behind a pickup truck and you can set it up in 3 hours and get going. This would take you 3, 4, 5 days to set it up. And basically in those days, there were some stationary mills, but the much more frequent way of sawing was that you brought the mill to the wood, and so this would be set up temporarily. And so this must have been a very typical scene. You know, you've got you've got these a few trees left standing, but everything else is on the ground, and it's going to feed that mill. Here's another mill, another portable mill. Portable, it's just, it would be there, they would set it up, and they would want to be there for many, many months. You would not move a mill every week. Here's a logging crew out on the ice with the high technology of the day, a crawler tractor pulling a scoop full of logs. And so this image to me, though, is the thing that I think of it. If the 38 hurricane has a silver lining, it's that it put people back to work. So, you've got all of these guys logging, you've got all of these guys working in sawmills, you've got all of this infrastructure that has to be rebuilt. And so suddenly you've got all sorts of people who were out of work, who now have an opportunity to work. And so this is, again, it's 1938. The Depression is still very, very much a factor in everybody's lives. So the largest storage site in Massachusetts was Harvard Pond, here with 6.5 million board feet. So you see this is in the ice. The reason they were very interested in preserving it is because if you let pine logs out, the white pine sawyer beetle is going to be in them within a few months, and you'll also get blue stain. And so they're trying to make sure that the the logs still had some value. I've got this next slide in as sort of an artifact of the time. This is not hurricane lumber, but it's lumber from that time. Take a look at those boards. I mean, look at that one. I mean, would you want to go to the local sawmill, local log yard, or lumber yard and buy that or that? I mean, so this wood is boxboard. So this is wood that was basically you send your pine log, you send limbs. If you got a limb that big, you send it through the mill because you can use it. And back in the 20s and 30s, this is before plastic, before cardboard. Things were shipped in wood, and so pine being so light, you can use, and to make a box. So you say you got to make a box this big. You don't need much, and so much of the wood is usable. And so at the time, a lot of the wood went into boxboard. And at the time of the hurricane, the Forest Service, when they came in, they were very, very insistent that they not buy round edge lumber. They are going to buy square edge lumber. They're going to teach New England how to saw lumber. And so, you know, the Forest Service has always had a very evangelical bent. And wherever they're involved, they really want to, you know, get people to change their ways. And so they wanted them to change their ways about their forest management and about their sawing practices. So I'm going to shift gear a little bit here and just show you what a forest that was leveled by the hurricane would look like today. This is me standing in my woods. I'm standing in a hole made by an uprooted tree from the '38 hurricane. You see, I mean, this is really a very, very big hole, but the contour in the ground basically follows that dead piece of wood there. And so you got this pit and that mound. So that's a sign of, it's a sign of wind, of a wind-blown tree, not necessarily a sign of a hurricane. Any tree that goes over, that's what happens. And so here's a tree that I can show you that went down and created the pit and mound. So you see where the tree had been standing is right there. All of that soil and rocks and whatever is attached to it comes out and is attached to the root wad right there. Over time, that root wad will just drop all of the soil. The roots will disintegrate, and you'll have this mound there. And so you can tell if you see a lot of this in your woods, you can tell if it was the '38 hurricane by the direction that the thing is, the combination of the pit and the mound. So if you stand in the pit and you look out over the mound, that tree fell in that direction. So the wind was behind you. So if that direction is the north or the northwest, then that means that wind was from the south or the southeast. You very rarely get wind from the south or southeast that's enough to blow down trees. So you can go in your woods and just check out that sort of configuration, and you'll be able to tell if it was from the '38 hurricane. You'll also see bent trees and trees that are shaped like this. The softwood on the left is a hemlock, and this one on the right is a hop hornbeam, and they right themselves over time. The hemlock by just sort of sweeping back to vertical. The hardwoods by shedding the rest of their trunk. So this trunk would have been going in that direction, and then what happens is one of the lower branches takes over, and it becomes the new leader. And so hardwoods that are tipped like that will have that characteristic boomerang shape. So here's some more. These are all in my woods. So basically, what you've got with the '38 hurricane is you've got this tremendous natural disturbance that was followed by the largest logging job that has ever happened in this area. And so it's a little hard to pick apart, you know, what's a result of the hurricane, what's a result of the salvage operation. But it was really a huge change to a significant portion of the landscape. The lasting effects, so in Vermont, which was very, as I said earlier, say it was half farmland and half forest. You've got this. You've got a lot of sugar bushes on the ground. At that point, a lot of people relied on sugaring as their little bit of extra cash. They could keep a hired man employed for a year. So maybe you make $700 or $800 a year from your sugar orchard, and that gets you the services of a hired man. So this was the final nail in the coffin for a lot of farmers, the 38 hurricane. And so right here you got an image taken from the same spot with a gap of 70 or so years. This photo showing the hurricane damage up there. You see it's not totally knocked over. It's more like a bad haircut, I picture it as. But you see all this open ground there. And there's a line, a fence row, and this is it today. And so hardwoods seeded in below that ridge line. It's all hardwoods there. The wetter area, pine and spruce. So Vermont has grown a new age class of northern hardwoods, and we've got the typical white pine that grows in on farm fields. Different story in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, where you basically had this temporary glut of white pine. That white pine came in as the farm fields were abandoned. White pine colonizes abandoned pasture, abandoned cropland very, very readily. And so, as I said earlier, you had more white pine standing in Massachusetts and New Hampshire than you ever did before. And then a lot of that went down in the 38 hurricane. So basically what happened was the forest, because of the hurricane, has reverted to the more natural forest that was here, the original forest that was here, a mix of oak and pine and other black birch. So Thoreau in 1860 talked about this phenomenon just read, standing on the edge of this pine grove, you would have said there's not a hardwood tree in it, young or old. But on looking carefully along its floor, I discovered not merely here or there, but with a degree of regularity, a little oak. And so in under this what seems like an entirely pine forest, you have these oak seedlings. And those oak seedlings, when the pine was blown down, became the new forest. So a lot of it was seedlings, and then in other places it was sprouts. So when if there was hardwood in there and the hardwood was cut, you got a lot of sprout trees. And so Massachusetts forest, you'll see tons of sprout trees that are, a lot of them, the result of the 38 hurricane. So basically, if you look at this forest, you see that there's a green underbrush, and that would be what would take over if you knocked down all of those trees. The smaller trees would take over as the next forest. So in the 80 years since the hurricane, we've had tremendous recovery. We've had 80 years worth of growth. We've had in places where there weren't forests, we now have forests. So we have a much more mature forest than we've had really since settlement. And so with that, we have increased vulnerability to the next hurricane. So we have a much more mature forest. We have much more forest cover, and so we have a really nice situation for another. If we were to get another hurricane of the magnitude of 38, it would be considerably more forest damage than there was in 38. There'd also be a lot more damage to the infrastructure, because we've got about twice as many people living in the footprint of the 38 hurricane. There was 9 million at the time in New England and Long Island combined, and now it's about 17 million. So I think a good way to think about what would happen to New England if a 38 hurricane were to come through is look at what happened in Puerto Rico with Maria. It was, really tremendously devastating storm, knocked out the infrastructure. People did not have electricity or phone. You think of, well, you got cell phones, so you're going to be fine. Well, cell phones rely on cell towers. Those towers are going to be vulnerable. They're not going to have power. And so if we have another 38, it's going to be a devastating event, and one that we'll be able to tell our grandchildren about. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Anyone have any questions?
So, yeah, I'm happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
So if we drop the 38 hurricane as it was today, what would the effect be? The trees that came down would be the same trees, but it was a category 2 or 3 hurricane, from what I understand.
Category 2, yeah.
As opposed to Maria that hit Puerto Rico as a 5.
Right.
So how would the effects be different with all our new technology from your point of view?
So first off, there wouldn't be many deaths because we would know that this was coming. So people would be able to shelter. No one would be caught on the coast unawares. People have rebuilt down there, so there's beachfront properties are going to get ripped out to sea. You're going to have more infrastructure damage because there are so many more people here, and you'll have flooding, the same sort of thing. The difference between a Category 2 and a Category 5, on paper looks like a lot. But it doesn't, all it takes is a Category 1 or a Category 2 to knock down trees. And so, so you get to a 5 and yeah, that's worse, but a Category 2 is plenty to really do an equal amount or more damage. So the same places that were vulnerable in 38 will be vulnerable again. Southeast facing slopes, and so they can expect it to happen, and places that didn't have trees in 38 are now vulnerable. So I really do think that the insurance adjusters have estimated that this is about a 10-year-old estimate of $40 billion to make repairs. But I think that's probably, given what we've seen with some of the other hurricanes in the last 3, 4, 5 years, I think that number is probably double it.
Are any great historic trees lost? 400-year-old trees that you know of, that well-known names?
Well, I know. I mean, the various parks, and Rollins Park in Concord went down. There's in Pisgah State Forest in New Hampshire. It was an old growth forest, and a lot of that went down. And within that very large forest, there's a 20-acre patch owned by Harvard Forest, and they decided not to salvage that. And so you've got this 20-acre piece in the middle of Pisgah State Park that shows what happens if you don't salvage. And there's pine that, you know, this big, trees that were that big, that are now horizontal, and 80 years later, they're still there. I mean, you could walk on them, and they haven't rotted. It's really, really phenomenal.
Is it known what caused the sharp turn to the west, when normally the pattern would be to go up to the east? Is there a cause and effect that it's understood now?
Yeah, it was a combination of the Bermuda High being in a more northerly position so that it couldn't recurve out to the North Atlantic, and the way that the weather patterns had set up over the continent. You know, it's sort of, you know, the phrase, the perfect storm is overused by now, but it was that really perfect combination of the steering currents over the continent, wanting to move things. It was a really deep trough in it instead of sort of a shallow. It was very, very deep, and so it made a corridor that basically went north-south. And so the combination of that and the no place to go to the east made that happen.
Looking for something optimistic, is the current forest more resilient because it's a mixed forest? Would you be more optimistic that it wouldn't all blow down?
I think that tall trees on tall trees facing south or east are going to blow down. The fact that it is that it's a different mix of species. I don't think that's going to. I mean, pine will be taller and it will be more vulnerable. There's less pine, so. But if you've got 80-year-old trees, they're plenty tall to blow down. It's a natural disturbance. You know, this. I mean, it's once every 80, once every 50 years. But this is you know, we do get these, and so you know, I think looking at places like that 20-acre patch in Pisgah, I mean, that shows you resilience right there. That this forest, it's, you know, it's a horizontal forest that has now, it was a horizontal forest that's now grown up to a different forest, but everything was in place there. And the forest, it regrows. So it'll be devastating, but it's temporary. So I would say that the message is that it's a shock to the system, but it's a natural shock to the system, and it will regrow.
Did the hurricane also generate tornadoes?
Yeah, there were embedded tornadoes in the eye wall. So there were instances of locally, you know, they wouldn't last for long, but locally there were tornadoes.
Was the path that the storm followed once it turned north pretty much on top of the Gulf Stream, or is that further out, the Gulf Stream? Seems like it would keep it warm water, might have strengthened it.
Well, no, I mean the path. You mean the path from Florida up?
Right. Did that go over by chance on top of the Gulf Stream, or where?
I guess it would have crossed it. It would have crossed the Gulf Stream. But that's a good question, because it points out that warm water is the source of power for a hurricane, and so the reason that those three storms were so devastating, the 1635, 1815, and 1938, the reason they were so devastating is they did not make landfall before they got here. If they made landfall, like Irene was a big deal for most of us, but Irene was a flood. The winds were dissipated because it had made landfall 3 or 4 times before it hit. So if it's over the ocean for all that time, then it's still got its power. and it was going 50 miles an hour. That's why it kept its power all the way through to Vermont.
It's my understanding that as a result of the tornadoes and so on that are come along with a hurricane, that the wood that has been affected by that is not usable for structural building and that sort of thing. Is that correct? Because it's been twisted and...
On the tornadoes,
Yeah.
it is a different effect on wood. I can't tell you for certain. I was in the one, is it Brimstone? Brimfield. I was there, I saw that. Very interesting phenomenon there. There's a very, very clean edge of where the wind where it came through. Here it's affected, here it's not. It was really quite remarkable. Within that, I can't say that I noticed that wood was, twisted. So I don't know. But hurricane wood, and the wood that went down in the 38 hurricane, there was nothing about it that made it unusable.
I have a stand in Wilbraham that shows the positive effect of something like this. The tornado went through this particular wooded area. It leveled everything, and we now have about over 50 American chestnuts that are over 30 feet tall at this point, growing there. So it's a rather interesting effect, similar to people clear land someplace.
Right, yeah, so this natural disturbance changed the forest structure from being a taller canopy, took down the taller canopy, and what was underneath it came up, and what was underneath it happened to be chestnut sapling.
One other thing, there's a stretch of land that goes out from Watch Hill on Rhode Island. It goes out into the ocean mostly to the west, somewhat south. It's surrounded by a bay on one side and open to the ocean on the other. There were homes out there, and every one of them was destroyed.
Right.
And some of them moved about a mile inward.
Some of the houses
shows how tremendous the surge is. What it does.
Yes, it is. It is tremendous, and there was a lot of a number of the books have talked about that community and what happened. What happened there. It was very dramatic.
What percentage of the timber knocked over by the hurricane was actually solid?
Almost half. So out of 2.6 billion, I think the final tally was somewhere like 1.2. So it was a lot. It was a lot, and a lot of that wood. So I told you about the Forest Service trying to break New Englanders of the boxboard habit and getting us really nice square edge lumber out of it. So they did, and so you got all of this square edge lumber, and then World War II comes along, and one of the highest uses of that lumber was crates and boxes for shipping materials to Europe. So the best laid plans of masonry.
One thing that we've kind of noticed more anecdotally, growing chestnuts and Mass and Rhode Island, is that the forest canopy seems to be shorter, closer to the ocean. So, there's the fact that, there's hurricanes fairly regularly and it blows things down, but do trees also sense like the average wind velocity and make their canopies shorter? Is that known among foresters? If it's a higher wind area?
I think it's probably more a question of the soil, the quality of the soil. Be drier.
Standing,
Yeah.
Okay.
I had some white pine that had a sweep in the trunk.
Yeah.
And I figured it was 38 hurricane.
But I cut one down, and then
Yeah.
I counted the growth rings where they distorted. It did go right back to 1938.
It did,
Yeah.
yeah.
And also the several trees that were there, the sweep was in the same direction.
Uh-huh, yeah. Yeah, so for a lot of trees, the best thing that ever happened to them was the 38 hurricane. You know, so it gave them all of this light. So there they are in the understory, and they get their opportunity to flourish. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to reinforce at one point you made. My my wife's father came over from Italy in 1936. He was in Hartford, and in '38 he got a phone call from one of his friends from the same village, and basically said, "Hey, you have one hell of a storm coming your way," and that's how he heard about the storm coming.
Somebody in Italy?
No, somebody from New Haven. He was in Hartford. Yeah. No, he was only over in this country for like 2 years at that point.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there is another interesting part to this stand that I mentioned, the chestnut. I cut one of the larger trees by accident because he's so dark I didn't think it was chestnut, and it turned out it was. But the rings up till the year that the tornado went through are barely visible.
Yeah.
And then right after that, you've got rings that are about 1/4 of an inch wide.
Right.
So you see this dramatic switch from
Yeah.
very little growth at all to, you know, a fantastic growth rate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a slide that I usually have in this presentation, but I changed it to get more stuff about this area. So I don't have it, but I have a close photo of a tree cookie that shows precisely that this tree was 2.5 inches. It was 80, this is a sugar maple, 80 years old and 38, 2.5 inches, that's it. Sugar maple is great at staying alive underneath the canopy.
Right.
And then I cut that tree in 2011, and it was a 14-inch tree at that point. So it grew 12 inches in those years.
Yeah.
And those rings, yeah, quarter inch rings.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to you all.
Okay, so now, it's time for lunch, so that's really good. We're gonna be doing a buffet, and I think there's gonna be different, like, food stations at different